April 30th, 1945. In a Berlin bunker, Eva Braun bit into cyanide beside Adolf Hitler. Above ground, the Reich lay in ruins. Women who once dined in marble halls now dragged carts of potatoes through bombed-out streets. From silks and champagne to rags and hunger, what became of them? The wives of Nazi Germany, once untouchable, now hunted, jailed, or forgotten. One stood trial. Another begged for scraps. Some vanished into silence. This is the untold fate of the Nazi wives after the fall of the Reich. Spring 1945. The Reich crumbled in fire and rubble. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the Allied armies surged across Germany. Their mission was clear: capture the men who had built Hitler's empire and bring them to justice. But the hunt did not end with the generals and ministers. Eyes soon turned to their wives. For 12 years, these women had lived at the very heart of Nazi privilege. They moved through gilded halls, draped in silks and diamonds, dining with Hitler and Goebbels while Europe burned. Some held quiet influence, whispering in their husbands' ears. Others enjoyed the estates, servants, and luxuries built on war and blood. When the Reich fell, the tables turned. They were interrogated, stripped of property, forced into exile, and, in some cases, dragged before tribunals themselves. A life of velvet gowns gave way to ration cards and rented rooms. The question lingered, whispered in Allied courts and survivor testimonies alike. Were these women simply wives swept along by history, or were they accomplices, bound by loyalty and ideology to the crimes of the Reich? Our story begins with none other than Hitler's own wife, Eva Braun. For more than a decade, she lived in his shadow, rarely photographed, never mentioned in public speeches, and almost entirely hidden from the German people. To the outside world, the Führer was a man married only to his nation. In reality, Eva Braun had been by his side since the early 1930s, first as a young Munich shop assistant swept into his orbit, then as his mistress, and eventually as the closest person to him in private life. At Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Eva's life was a strange contradiction. Shielded from the brutality of politics, she enjoyed the privileges of power: lavish parties, private cinema screenings, and shopping trips across occupied Europe. Photographs show her lounging in fur coats, laughing with friends, or posing with her 2 Scottish terriers. She was not a policymaker, nor did she wield political power. But she was surrounded by the luxuries carved out of a regime built on conquest and death. By 1945, the dream world collapsed. As Allied armies encircled Berlin, Hitler summoned Eva to the Führerbunker. She could have fled south, perhaps even survived the war. Instead, she made a fateful choice: to remain with him to the end. In those final days, while shells thundered above, she sat beside Hitler, calm and loyal, scribbling notes in her diary and occasionally slipping away to smoke cigarettes. On April 29th, in the depths of the bunker, Eva finally received what she had always longed for. She married Adolf Hitler in a brief ceremony, wearing a simple black dress. For a few hours, she became Germany's first lady. Witnesses remembered her smiling radiantly, as if oblivious to the chaos outside. Yet the marriage was little more than a prelude to death. The very next day, April 30th, 1945, Eva swallowed cyanide alongside her husband, while Hitler placed a pistol to his temple. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden, doused in petrol, and set alight by loyal aides. The ashes were hurriedly buried in a shallow crater as the Red Army closed in. Eva Braun was just 33 years old. For the Allies who later stormed the bunker, Eva remained an enigma. Was she simply a naive young woman blinded by devotion, or a silent accomplice who chose luxury over morality? She never stood trial, never answered a question in court, never explained her choices. Her life ended where her husband's did, consumed by fire and buried under the ruins of Berlin. But Eva's death was only the beginning, because while she chose to perish with Hitler, another woman just a few steps away made a darker, more shocking choice, one that would leave the world haunted for decades. If Eva Braun was the hidden bride of Hitler, Magda Goebbels was his queen. Born Magda Ritschl in 1901, she came from an ordinary middle-class family. Her early life was unremarkable. Schooling, a first marriage that ended in divorce, until she entered the circle of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's fiery minister of propaganda. By 1931, she became his wife. And from that moment, her life transformed into one of power, luxury, and terrible devotion. Magda was more than a wife. She was a symbol. Tall, elegant, and blonde, she fit perfectly into the Nazi ideal of Aryan motherhood. She gave Joseph 6 children, each of their names beginning with H in honor of Hitler himself: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heydrich. Together, the Goebbels family became a living poster of Nazi values, paraded at rallies, photographed for magazines, and admired by millions. She moved with ease in the highest circles of the Reich, often dining at Hitler's table, her children sitting on his lap. While the men waged war, Magda embodied the image of sacrifice, loyalty, and family, an image the regime used shamelessly. She wore diamonds, entertained guests at lavish estates, and stood as the First Lady of Nazi Germany, especially after Hitler refused to marry Eva Braun publicly. But as the war turned, that image began to crack. By 1944, Germany was collapsing under Allied bombardment. In April 1945, the Soviets closed in on Berlin. Magda and Joseph Goebbels moved their family into Hitler's bunker, where the end of the Reich played out in darkness and despair. Here, Magda revealed the depth of her fanaticism. She could not accept a world without Hitler, nor could she imagine her children living in defeat. She confided to friends that life after National Socialism was not worth living. So she made her choice. On the night of May 1st, 1945, Magda dressed her 6 children in white nightclothes. One by one, she gave them a fatal dose of morphine. When they were unconscious, cyanide capsules were crushed into their mouths. Some accounts suggest the eldest daughter, Helga, resisted. Bruises were later found on her body. But by dawn, all 6 children lay dead on the bunker mattresses, their golden hair and pale faces turned into the most haunting image of the Nazi collapse. With the children gone, Magda and Joseph walked into the Chancellery garden. There they took cyanide and ended their lives. Their bodies later burned. For the world outside, the discovery was a shock. Photos of the dead Goebbels children became a symbol of how ideology had poisoned not just soldiers and politicians, but families. Magda's act remains one of the most chilling examples of loyalty carried to madness. And yet, not every Nazi wife chose death. Some survived the war. They did not walk into flames or swallow poison, but instead lived to face trials, interrogations, and the slow erosion of their former glory. Not every Nazi wife lived to face justice, but those who did would see their worlds collapse. Born Emma Sonnemann in 1893, she was a successful stage actress in Germany during the 1920s. With her striking looks and talent, she caught the attention of powerful men. None, however, matched the wealth and ambition of Hermann Goering, Hitler's flamboyant second-in-command and commander of the Luftwaffe. When she married him in 1935, Emmy stepped into a world of unimaginable privilege. Hermann Goering adored his wife and spoiled her with gifts beyond imagining. Jewels, furs, art, and estates flowed into her possession, much of it looted from occupied Europe. Emmy presided over Karen Hall, Goering's sprawling estate, where hunting parties, opera performances, and grand feasts dazzled Nazi elites. She hosted foreign diplomats, mingled with film stars, and was often called the First Lady of the Reich, especially as Hitler refused to present Eva Braun publicly. She reveled in it. Emmy wore Paris gowns and diamonds while German women rationed soap and queued for bread. Her life was a performance, staged in marble halls and opera houses while the war machine roared outside. Yet behind the glamour lay complicity. The riches she enjoyed were stolen, the comforts built on suffering. The fall came swiftly. In May 1945, as Allied forces seized Germany, Emmy was arrested alongside her husband. Hermann Goering faced the Nuremberg trials as one of the chief architects of the regime. Emmy's own fate was less dramatic but deeply humiliating. Classified as a beneficiary of the Nazi system, she was tried in a denazification court. She protested her innocence, claiming she had lived only for art and family, not politics. But her life of luxury was too visible to ignore. The court stripped her of her property and wealth. Her jewels and estates were seized. She was banned from performing on the stage, the career that had once given her fame and dignity. Suddenly, the woman who had waltzed through gilded halls was left to scrape by in post-war Germany. Her existence shrank to a small apartment in Munich. No more carriages, no more servants, no more silks. Ration cards replaced the fine menus of Karen Hall. Emmy never forgave the world for her fall. Friends recalled her bitterness, her constant complaints about what she had lost, and her refusal to see herself as complicit. She lived quietly, fading from public life, until her death in 1973. Hermann Goering's end had been sensational. Suicide by cyanide on the eve of his execution. Emmy's end was the opposite. A long decline into obscurity, stripped of everything but her memories. Not all Nazi wives had the stage and spotlight. Some lived in shadows, defined by their husband's ruthless efficiency. And when the Reich fell, their lives shattered in silence, leaving them with only ashes of a name that once inspired fear. Reinhard Heydrich was known by many names: the Butcher of Prague, the Blonde Beast, the Hangman. He was one of the chief architects of the Holocaust and the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was planned. Cold, brilliant, and merciless, he was feared even within Nazi circles. And at his side, from the very beginning, was his wife, Lina Heydrich. Born Lina von Osten in 1911, she grew up in a nationalist conservative family. Fiercely devoted to the Nazi cause, Lina was already a party member before she met Reinhard. They married in 1931, when Heydrich was still an ambitious young officer. She believed in his destiny and encouraged his rapid ascent through the SS ranks. Together, they became one of the regime's most formidable power couples. During the war, Lina lived in luxury. The couple's villa in Prague became a symbol of Nazi power in occupied Czechoslovakia. She entertained guests, managed the household, and enjoyed the privileges that came with her husband's position: cars, servants, estates seized from Czech families. Reinhard may have been the ruthless hand of the Reich, but Lina basked in the shadow of his power. That shadow collapsed in 1942. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague by Czechoslovak resistance fighters trained by the British. His death triggered brutal reprisals: the destruction of Lidice, the mass execution of men, women, and children. While the world condemned his cruelty, Lina mourned a husband she considered a hero. After Germany's defeat in 1945, Lina's fate might have seemed sealed. As the widow of one of the most notorious Nazis, many expected she would face trial. Instead, she emerged largely untouched. Interrogated by Allied forces, she admitted little, denied involvement, and portrayed herself as a devoted wife with no role in politics. She kept her villa in Prague for a time and later moved to West Germany, where she raised her children. Far from being silenced by shame, Lina defended Reinhard's legacy for the rest of her life. She gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and insisted he was a good man who loved his family. In her telling, Reinhard was not the architect of mass murder, but a disciplined soldier and loving father. Survivors and historians recoiled at her words, but Lina never wavered. She lived comfortably, drawing a widow's pension from the West German government, which controversially recognized her claim as the wife of a fallen officer. Until her death in 1985, Lina never expressed regret or guilt. Instead, she remained fiercely loyal to the memory of the man history rightly remembers as one of the darkest figures of the Nazi regime. While Lina Heydrich chose denial and loyalty, clinging to the myth of her husband's honor, others took a different path. One wife, rather than fading quietly into post-war life, made herself the center of a lifelong crusade, an obsession that blurred the line between memory, guilt, and revenge. Among the wives of the Reich, few carried their loyalty so openly, so stubbornly, as Ilse Hess. She was not married to a fading general or a disgraced minister, but to one of the earliest and most fanatical disciples of Adolf Hitler, Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer. Their story was bound up with the strange, almost surreal fate of Rudolf himself, whose flight to Britain in 1941 became one of the most bizarre episodes of the war. Ilse Koch was born in Hanover in 1900 into a patriotic middle-class family. She met Rudolf Hess in the 1920s when he was still a struggling student enthralled by Hitler's speeches. Like him, she was drawn to the Nazi cause early, fascinated by its promise of national renewal through the party ranks. Eventually becoming Deputy Führer, Ilse enjoyed the privileges that came with her husband's power. A fine home in Munich, servants, and a life far removed from the struggles of ordinary Germans. In the 1930s, Rudolf Hess stood just below Hitler in the hierarchy of the Reich. Ilse was at his side, a quiet but loyal partner, embodying the model of the Nazi wife. Dutiful, devoted, and unquestioning. Yet in 1941, her life changed in an instant. Without warning, Rudolf flew solo to Scotland in a desperate attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. Instead of glory, he found a prison cell. For the rest of the war, Ilse lived in limbo, the wife of a man branded mad, imprisoned by the enemy, yet still loyal to Hitler. When Germany collapsed in 1945, Ilse did not lose her husband to execution, as so many others did. Instead, she faced decades of waiting. Rudolf Hess was tried at Nuremberg, sentenced to life in Spandau prison in Berlin, and became the longest-held prisoner of the war. Ilse devoted herself entirely to his cause. She organized petitions, wrote articles, and lobbied governments, insisting on his release. She painted him not as a criminal, but as a misguided idealist, a man of peace who had risked everything to end the war. For decades, she campaigned tirelessly, visiting him when allowed, raising their only son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, to continue the fight. Her campaigns were often ignored, sometimes mocked, but she never relented. Even as public memory of the Reich shifted, Ilse remained locked in her mission, freeing Rudolf, but she never succeeded. In 1987, Rudolf Hess died in Spandau prison, officially by suicide at age 93. To his family, including Ilse, it was murder. To the world, it was the final act of a man who had never repented. Ilse lived on in Munich until 1995, outliving her husband by nearly a decade. She remained devoted to his memory until her death, a woman defined entirely by loyalty. If Ilse Hess clung to her husband's legacy with fierce devotion, others took a different path, choosing instead to erase the past, to reinvent themselves, and even to rebuild fortunes from the ruins of defeat. Few women embodied the strange fusion of art, politics, and power in the Third Reich more than Winifred Wagner. She was not German by birth, but English. Born Winifred Williams in Hastings, 1897, orphaned young, and raised in Germany. By chance and fate, she married into one of Europe's most famous dynasties, the Wagner family, heirs of composer Richard Wagner, whose music Hitler adored. Through that marriage, she inherited not just a name but a stage, the Bayreuth Festival, the beating heart of German opera. When her husband Siegfried Wagner, the composer's only son, died in 1930, Winifred became the matriarch of Bayreuth. She was just 33, with 4 children to raise and a festival to run. But she also had a powerful admirer. Adolf Hitler, already a rising politician, was obsessed with Wagner's music. Winifred opened Bayreuth's doors to him, offering friendship, loyalty, and hospitality. He became a frequent guest, treated like family. She supplied him with paper and ink from Mein Kampf while he was in prison. For Hitler, Bayreuth became almost a second home. Under Winifred, Bayreuth became a cultural jewel of the Reich. Each summer, dignitaries, generals, and party elites gathered at the festival, where Wagner's operas, filled with mythic heroes, Teutonic gods, and apocalyptic struggles, were staged as symbols of Nazi destiny. Winifred presided like a queen. She adored Hitler, and rumors swirled for years that she might become his wife, though it never happened. What is certain is that her festival became one of the regime's most elegant propaganda tools. But in 1945, when the Reich collapsed, Bayreuth's gates closed. Winifred was interrogated by Allied authorities. Her loyalty to Hitler was well known. Her letters and photographs made it undeniable. She was banned from managing the festival, branded a Nazi sympathizer, and stripped of her influence. For years, she lived quietly, while her children, especially Wolfgang and Wieland Wagner, took over Bayreuth. Unlike many Nazi wives, Winifred did not fade into poverty or obscurity. She remained at the family's Villa Wahnfried in Bayreuth, still revered by some old admirers, still a figure of controversy. She never renounced Hitler. In fact, well into the 1970s, she continued to speak warmly of him in interviews, calling him a great man. Her lack of remorse shocked many, yet she insisted she had only ever served art, not politics. Her children rebuilt Bayreuth after the war, reinventing the festival as a symbol of modern Germany's culture. Under them, the Wagner legacy not only survived, but thrived, attracting international audiences and critical acclaim. The family dynasty endured, even as Winifred herself remained marked by her devotion to the Führer. When she died in 1980, she left behind a legacy both brilliant and tainted. The woman who saved Bayreuth, but also tied it forever to Hitler's shadow. If Winifred Wagner could pass her dynasty on to her children, securing comfort and cultural immortality, others were left with nothing but ruins, struggling simply to survive day to day in the ashes of the Reich. Among all the wives of the Nazi elite, few lived closer to the machinery of terror than Margarete Himmler. She was the wife of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, the architect of the concentration camp system, and one of the most feared men in the Reich. Though she rarely appeared in public, Margarete lived a life steeped in the privileges created by the SS empire. Born Margarete Boden in 1893, she was trained as a nurse before marrying Heinrich Himmler in 1928. At that time, Himmler was still a rising party official, not yet the towering figure he would become. Margarete, older than her husband by 7 years, was practical, orderly, and deeply committed to the nationalist ideals that shaped the Nazi movement. Together, they presented the image of a model German family. They had one daughter, Gudrun, in 1929. As Himmler rose to power, Margarete's world expanded. She managed estates confiscated from Jews and occupied peoples, presided over SS-run hospitals and charitable foundations, and enjoyed the comforts of a household sustained by the wealth of plunder. Their villa in Gmund on Lake Tegernsee became a retreat for the Himmler family, furnished with fine art and staffed with servants. To the outside world, Margarete was the dutiful wife of the Reich's second most powerful man. To those inside the system, she was a symbol of SS privilege. Yet the marriage itself was strained. Heinrich Himmler was notoriously unfaithful, maintaining mistresses and fathering children outside the marriage. Margarete, however, remained loyal to him publicly, if not always privately. She shared his ideological views, corresponded with him about matters of health, race, and the war, and embraced her role within the SS family network. The collapse of the Reich shattered that life. In May 1945, Heinrich Himmler was captured by British forces and committed suicide shortly after. Margarete and her daughter were arrested and interrogated. Allied investigators quickly identified her as more than a bystander. She had lived in privilege, benefited directly from the spoils of conquest, and taken part in SS welfare institutions. Though she was not tried at Nuremberg, she was officially classified as a Nazi collaborator. Her property was confiscated, her reputation destroyed. From then on, Margarete lived in obscurity, moving quietly between relatives and small towns. Unlike some widows who reinvented themselves or openly defended their husbands, she largely disappeared from public life. She never publicly denounced Heinrich Himmler, never expressed remorse for her years at the pinnacle of SS privilege. Margarete Himmler died in 1967, a faded figure, remembered only in relation to her notorious husband. She left no memoirs, no great defense, just silence and the shadow of complicity. If Margarete Himmler embodied the quiet privilege of the SS elite, Ilse Koch became its grotesque caricature. She was not only the wife of Karl Koch, commandant of Buchenwald, but also one of the most notorious figures in the dark mythology of the camps. To survivors, she was remembered as the bitch of Buchenwald. To the Allied press, she was the witch. Her name became synonymous with cruelty. Born Ilse Koch in Dresden in 1906, she was a bookkeeper before meeting Karl Koch, an ambitious SS officer. They married in 1936, and together they built their lives inside the Nazi concentration camp system. At Buchenwald, where Karl became commandant, the couple lived in a villa overlooking the barbed wire. While prisoners starved and suffered, the Kochs enjoyed fine dinners, music, and luxury goods seized from inmates. Ilse reveled in her status. Survivors recalled her riding on horseback through the camp, selecting prisoners for punishment with the flick of a whip. Rumors spread of her fascination with tattooed skin. Witnesses later claimed she ordered human skin preserved and fashioned into lampshades and book covers, grisly trophies of power. Whether every story was true or embellished, the legend of Ilse Koch embodied the sadistic cruelty of the camps. The fall of the Reich brought no escape. Karl Koch had already been executed by the SS itself in 1945 for corruption, but Ilse was captured by American forces. Her trial was one of the most sensational of the post-war era. Survivors testified to her brutality, to her collections of human remains, to her reign of terror at Buchenwald. In 1947, an American military tribunal sentenced her to life imprisonment. But in 1948, under controversial circumstances, her sentence was reduced to 4 years. The decision sparked outrage. Survivors and the press denounced it as a betrayal of justice, and the scandal forced German courts to reopen her case. In 1951, Ilse Koch was retried in West Germany. This time, she was again sentenced to life. Behind bars, Ilse remained a figure of hatred and fascination. She received hundreds of letters, some from admirers, others from those who wanted her to rot in prison. She gave birth to a child while imprisoned, the father a fellow inmate. Her notoriety clung to her like a curse. For more than 15 years, she lived behind prison walls, denied appeals, shunned by society, and haunted by her own infamy. On September 1, 1967, Ilse Koch hanged herself in her cell at Eichach prison. She was 60 years old. To the end, she never confessed guilt, never admitted to the horrors tied to her name. Ilse Koch represented the depths of cruelty to which power could descend. Her fate was a grim reminder that the world had not forgotten. But not every wife of the Reich fully submitted to the ideology or wallowed in cruelty. Some, caught between loyalty and survival, chose to turn against the very system that had once elevated them. Henriette von Schirach's story reads like a cautionary tale of how proximity to power can both elevate and destroy. Born into Bavarian aristocracy in 1913, Henriette Hoffmann was the daughter of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. This connection meant that from an early age she moved in the circles of the Nazi elite. Charming, elegant, and intelligent, Henriette became part of Hitler's private world, a socialite who hosted dinners, attended galas, and joined Eva Braun at the Führer's retreats. In 1932, she married Baldur von Schirach, the rising star of the Nazi Party. Baldur, appointed leader of the Hitler Youth, wielded enormous influence over Germany's youth and later became Gauleiter of Vienna. Their union was the marriage of power and privilege. The von Schirachs lived in palaces, wore tailored uniforms and gowns, and stood at Hitler's side during the Reich's most triumphant years. For Henriette, life seemed like a fairy tale written in black, red, and swastika banners. But beneath the glittering surface, doubts began to stir. Henriette was not a fanatic like Magda Goebbels or a sadist like Ilse Koch. Her diaries reveal a woman more interested in art, culture, and family than racial dogma. By the early 1940s, living in Vienna, she witnessed firsthand the brutality of Nazi rule. She saw Jews herded onto trains, entire neighborhoods emptied, and the silent grief of those left behind. In June 1943, during a dinner at Hitler's Bavarian retreat, Henriette made a fatal mistake. She spoke her mind. Over coffee, she confronted Hitler about the deportations of Vienna's Jews, saying it was inhuman. The table fell silent. No one contradicted the Führer, least of all, a woman. Hitler's response was cold fury. He dismissed her criticism, accused her of betrayal, and ended their friendship on the spot. From that moment, Henriette was persona non grata in Hitler's inner circle. The Reich collapsed 2 years later, and with it, the von Schirach's fortune. Baldur was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity. Henriette herself was arrested and briefly imprisoned by the Allies, though she was never convicted of major crimes. Released in 1948, she returned to a shattered Germany. Gone were the palaces and parties. She scraped by raising her children, cut off from the privileges she once enjoyed. Unlike many Nazi wives who retreated into silence, Henriette eventually tried to tell her story. In 1974, she published her memoirs, The Price of Glory. The book offered a rare inside view of Hitler's private world, though critics accused her of downplaying her complicity. She painted herself as a loyal wife caught between personal conscience and political loyalty, a woman punished for daring to question the Führer. Henriette von Schirach lived quietly until her death in 1992. A faded figure who had once dined with dictators and later lived as an outcast in post-war Germany. From velvet gowns to prison cells, from palaces to poverty, these women carried the shadows of the Reich long after its fall. Each story reveals how the intoxicating glow of power could vanish overnight, leaving only ruins, silence, and memory. Their lives remind us that privilege can shield people for a time, but history has a way of exposing what lies beneath. And so we ask, If power and loyalty blinded even those closest to the truth, could the same ever happen again today?